Thank you so much for coming to this strategically focused workshop and giving up your afternoon, your evening to be here. We're very interested in hearing all your views in due course. I just wanted to say a couple of words really about why this is a good moment to have this this workshop. Obviously, we're emerging from REF and all of the things that we've learned from that and the consultation. Some of you may be involved or be aware of the BA Languages Gateway, which is currently under development as a sort of one-stop shop online resource for all things language in the UK, languages and cultures, I should say, in the UK. Lots of other activities, lots of other subject associations which are converging at the moment, obviously including University Council of Modern Languages, which I chair. Plenty of cross-Whitehall activity as well. We may have people on the call who can tell us a little bit more about that. And also I noticed, and I don't know if Renee is here, Kogelbauer, but I did notice also Baroness Cousins is now a patron of ALL, Baroness Cousins from the APPG MFL. So I suppose just thinking of this as very much a collective enterprise, and today we're going to be thinking about all kinds of things really, but starting with issues of definition. And Charles Burdett, who is going to be taking this session together with Ainhoa Montoya. So Charles, and Ainhoa, who are known to many people here. Charles is Professor of Italian Studies and Director of the institute formerly known as the Institute of Modern Languages Research. Now, are we calling it ILCS or ILCS, Charles?
We prefer ILCS.
Okay, so now ILCS, and Ainhoa Montoya, who's also going to speak to us, who's Senior Lecturer in Latin American Studies at the School of Advanced Study. So that's going to be the first portion of the afternoon, and then we'll be hearing from Professor Nigel Harkness, who's here somewhere, who's Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Newcastle University, also Professor of 19th Century French Studies, and is here in his capacity as Chair of the Subject Benchmark Statement. Ed Welsh, Professor Ed Welsh, Carnegie Chair of French at the University of Aberdeen, who's here in his capacity as Deputy Chair of that Subject Benchmark Statement group, and Dr. Rasha Soliman, who is here, very familiar to me, Associate Professor of Arabic Language and Linguistics at the University of Leeds, and who was also part of that Subject Benchmark Advisory Group. So that will be the second part of this afternoon's activity. So now I'll just pass over to Charles and Ainhoa to tell us a little bit about the name change.
Thank you very much indeed, Emma, and to everyone for being here. I'm very mindful of people's time and aware that the urgent issue that we need to discuss is the draft subject benchmarking document. So we're going to be the first act, so to speak, and I'm going to be quite brief and speak quite quickly. We do, in fact, plan to organise a longer meeting on the development of the School of Advanced Study as a national centre for the humanities and the Institute's role within that in the next few weeks or months. So I'm just going to make a few observations and refer to the mission statement of the Institute, formerly known as the IMLR, which I hope everyone has been able to read. I think it is definitely true to say, as Emma has done, that this is a crucial time for the subject area. You have the subject benchmarking statement, the conclusions of the REF panel and its publicly available impact case studies. You have the report of the AHRC Future of Languages Research Fellows, the imminent launch of the British Academy's Language Gateway. Now, the energy behind all these initiatives, not to mention the immense amount of labour that they involve, will obviously be dissipated unless you do certain things with them. You have to speak quite loudly about the significance of this thinking and its relevance to the visibility and general understanding of your field. You have to think through the ramifications of these initiatives, and you have to build on them. But perhaps, above all, you have to ensure that the subject community as a whole understands, appropriates, and contributes to this thinking. The script concerning the general direction of travel has massive implications, not just for senior members of the academic staff who participate in many of these initiatives, but especially for early career researchers and for postgraduates aiming to come into the profession. When I spoke to Greg Walker, the chair of the English Studies Ref panel, and I asked him about this, his response was, you have absolutely no option but to do all of these things. So clearly this building process, and it is that, involves the work of many actors, of which the Institute is only one. But the effort has to be coordinated at every level. And it's worth stressing here that whatever agency we have lies above all in our power and our mission to convene. In our mission statement, we've indicated as concisely as possible what we understand our role to be. And just to take three areas of our activity: to shape the development of research culture in close collaboration with subject associations, the British Academy, the AHRC, and the UCML, to develop cutting-edge research training that supports the development of current and future generations of researchers, to advocate for greater inclusivity and diversity of representation. That is just three areas, and no one, I'm sure, would dispute the importance of this role. But you can perform this most effectively if it is clear how you are articulating with the subject community and moving purposefully and inclusively forward. And crucially, how all this work is contributing to the visibility and perceived importance of the subject area, both within the academy and, of course, without. So the work of representing and convening individual and collective research initiatives has to be accompanied by a series of strongly connected endeavours that are strategic in nature. And I want to point to just three of these quite briefly before ending what I have to say. First of all, the change of name. We have, as everyone knows, recently changed to the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies. The point of doing so is really so that we can more accurately define what we do and the purpose that it serves. The problem with the term modern languages is that it is ambiguous even within the humanities. It tends to be interpreted as referring to language acquisition or to linguistics. It fails to make explicitly the case for language study and research as an integral part of cultural and social understanding. It is much better to work with a more literal description of a subject area that is, of course, extremely wide-ranging and porous and open to interpretation. The definition also dispenses with any distinction between modern and community languages, which is increasingly untenable. It is indeed a source of satisfaction that our role in supporting the integrated study of languages, cultures, and societies has been welcomed in so many quarters, and especially by the early career researcher community. On to my second point. Making the subject area clearer across the humanities and social sciences facilitates engagement and it facilitates interdisciplinarity. This is especially important given the developing remit of the School of Advanced Study. One of the things that the Institute needs to do is to advance connections with organizations that focus on cultural and linguistic experience in other global contexts. Though we represent specific language communities, the aim is to develop formal connections with other areas, looking in particular to develop synergies with SOAS and with the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And this is important for the development of the disciplinary area, but is also important for the range of opportunities that we can facilitate for early career researchers, for how we extend our involvement within the wider community, how we work with schools at all levels, and how we promote greater inclusivity. The third and final area that I want to talk very briefly about is the changing nature of research culture. As I think we all know, there is an ever greater emphasis on knowledge exchange and co-production, as well as a need to show the relevance of what we do to address issues of urgent societal concern. This is again where it helps to be doing work that is publicly understood and is set up to be cross-disciplinary, that is conscious of its potential impacts and its policy dimensions. The connection with the social sciences is useful here, and the work of CLACS represents a very important resource that I know is going to speak about in just a second. But to finish with information about one or two initiatives. The School of Advanced Study will be concentrating its work across disciplinary fields, following the example of the extremely successful Digital Humanities Hub. It is, for example, setting up a centre on environmental humanities, and we will be disseminating a lot of information about that in the future. The Institute supports the journal Languages, Society and Policy, and we will be encouraging everyone who is organising events with us to consider how this might translate into a policy report of some kind. And finally, together with the British Academy, we will be running an event on what we have learned from the impact case studies and how we make the narrative of the REF work for us. What is key is that initiatives of this kind are embedded in the work that the subject community as a whole does. And I'll stop there and I'll leave the floor to Ainhoa.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks also to Emma for chairing, and also thank you everyone who has joined us in this event to relaunch our institute, as well as to discuss the subject benchmarking statement. And I'd just like to briefly refer to how the establishment of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, known as CLACS, is related to the renaming of the IMLR. And as many of you know, CLACS was established in 2021 as part of the IMLR to continue the activity of the former Institute of Latin American Studies, which had been founded in 1965. With CLACS coming to the IMLR, the remit of the Institute has expanded. Latin American Studies in the UK and elsewhere encompasses a range of disciplines and methodological approaches across the humanities and social sciences, and engages very directly with urgent societal issues. This is well reflected, for instance, in how scholars come together in the UK across a range of disciplines at the annual conferences of the Society for Latin American Studies or the Society for Caribbean Studies. This interdisciplinarity has characterized the work of ILAS as it does the work of CLACS. And as Charles has mentioned, this is the pathway we consider our disciplinary subject should take, which is very clearly captured by the redefinition of the Institute's remit as the integrated study of languages, cultures, and societies, whereby the relevance of languages and cultures is explicitly acknowledged in the research we conduct, but so are its potential societal implications. So with CLACS having established itself within the Institute, we have been convinced of the need to rename the IMLR. As Charles has mentioned, the term modern languages does not really work for us with its reference to culture and society that is only implicit. And furthermore, the term modern raises all kinds of questions, as Charles was also mentioning, about what is included and what is left out by it, whether, among others, indigenous languages and cultures, which we are attempting to bring in more prominently at CLACS in collaboration with indigenous scholars and indigenous associations, so whether these would be encompassed by the term. So the IMLR, renamed as the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies, ILCS, has been a very welcoming home for CLACS and for the research CLACS supports and facilitates across the humanities and social sciences. Indeed, there are also reasons to suggest that the establishment of CLACS at the Institute has been hugely successful. For instance, the work of the center is thriving and managing to promote interdisciplinary conversations on highly topical issues. And I'm just going to offer a few examples of how we have been doing this. So the knowledge exchange activities we host include conferences that bring together scholars of cultural studies and literature with historians, anthropologists, sociologists, geographers, or development scholars, as well as policymakers, artists, or activists to speak to a particular issue. And indeed, CLACS fellows and CLACS staff have organized very well-attended events on issues such as digital identity, religion, climate, capital and tourism, environmental humanities, which Charles was also referring to, or an upcoming conference that we have this month on human-made natural disasters. The open access book series that CLACS publishes with University of London Press is also a good reflection of how the center hosts interdisciplinary research and conversations, as well as of the wide interest in them. For instance, the publication downloads of these books are often in the range of the thousands. And just to offer you one example, Leslie Bethel's book, Brazil, Essays on History and Politics, was downloaded 3,366 times from December 2021 to April this year. And a final example of the connection with real-life issues of the work that CLACS pursues are the partnerships that we are establishing with external organizations and institutions. For instance, we have recently agreed with the UNESCO Regional Bureau for Education in Latin America and the Caribbean to become part of its Latin American and Caribbean Coalition to Education, and contribute expertise together with policymakers, indigenous experts, indigenous associations to debate and advise Latin American and Caribbean governments on how to include indigenous languages in the curricula, to effectively diversify it, and to do so in line with the goals of the 2022-2032 International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So in this vein, we can consider the establishment of CLACS at the Institute to have allowed us to accentuate the importance of the interdisciplinary field in engaging powerfully with relevant cultural and societal debates. And we consider CLACS as a resource for the work that the Institute does for its subject community in demonstrating and facilitating pathways for how to think about the social, political, and economic impact of research in the field of languages, cultures, and societies. And I think I'm going to stop here so that we can actually move on to hear about the subject benchmarking statement. So over to Emma, or to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ainoa. Thanks, Charles and Ainoa, for that really comprehensive overview of how the name change fits into the sort of wider context of our research areas and disciplinary field. And you might also find in the chat, if you can see the chat bar, there are a couple of links there which are quite helpful to the mission statement of the ILCS and to CLACS publications. So I think in the interest of time, Charles and I know have generously said they will sort of leave questions to the end so that we can talk together about languages, cultures and societies as a group. So I think without sort of further ado, well, possibly just a little bit of ado, I'll pass over to Nigel, Ed and Rasha. And just to say that we essentially the way this is going to work, I think, is that Nigel, Ed and Rasha will take slightly different aspects of the recently updated subject benchmark statement on languages, cultures and societies. Those of you who aren't aware of this sort of enterprise, it's developed over a period of just over 6 months, I think. Nigel, and it's currently out for consultation, which is, I suppose, partly why we're having this workshop, because we're very interested to get your views on it. And that consultation period ends on the 2nd of November. So I think Nigel will be speaking first with a sort of an overview of approach and changes to the subject benchmark statement. And you're going to highlight a couple of areas where you'd really appreciate people's feedback. Then Ed Welch is going to talk to us about the embedded themes, which is one of the key changes to this version of the subject benchmark statement. And then last but not least, Rasha, you are going to talk about the range of subdisciplines and links to linguistics and area studies. And I think tell us a little bit about C1 as well in relation to non-European languages studied ab initio. So I will pass over, I think, first to Nigel.
Thank you very much, Emma. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see almost 60 people on the call to give us an opportunity to share with you some of the thinking that's gone into the revised subject benchmark statement. And I want to thank Charles and Inoa for convening this webinar. And it does clearly speak to the convening power of the ILCS in terms of bringing the subject community together around issues that are very much worthy of debate, and grateful to them for giving Rasha, Ed and myself just an opportunity to share some thoughts with you. So the subject benchmark statement, I've just been checking, goes back to 2002. So we are celebrating almost the 20th anniversary of a subject benchmark statement, which in 2002 was for languages and related studies. I'm not quite sure what fell into the related studies part. Presumably that was things that perhaps now we see as much more central to the discipline than meriting that moniker related. But they took on the title of Subject Benchmark Statement for Languages, Cultures and Societies in 2015. And then that document was updated, was given, I think, a light touch update in 2019 to reflect some changes in the regulatory environment. So we were, when we convened as a group, really starting with a document that had quite a significant legacy of having been built up through dialogue with the subject community. And there's a lot in that 2019 subject benchmark statement, which you will find kind of threaded through, or indeed kind of almost reproduced verbatim in this subject benchmark statement. This is not something where we have ripped everything up and started again, but we probably have tried to reflect somewhere. And it's I think, what one of the other areas where I see a tie-up with what Charles and I know have been talking about in relation to the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies. It's kind of trying to think about where we are now as a subject community and a very diverse discipline, many kind of subdisciplines, lots of different perspectives on our discipline. I don't think any 2 degrees in languages, cultures and societies right up and down the country are the same. There are lots and lots of differences. So that diversity of the subject area, we're really keen to draw together a group that could reflect that. So I hope that we've kind of achieved that and brought some of that thinking through into the subject benchmark statement that we've now put out to consultation. And I guess in that, as I was saying, we're trying to balance a sense of where the discipline is right now in all that diversity. QAA asks us, really gives us the task of producing a document that says that someone in the field or a student or a graduate could read it and would recognize as speaking to their experience of either teaching or studying languages, cultures, and societies. So it has to describe. We were encouraged not to prescribe, so not to tell people what to do. So hopefully you don't find too much of that in here. But I guess in describing the present as a group and in our discussions, we're always kind of keen to try to identify things that are changing, that are in flux, and maybe just to set out some things that speak to the future, perhaps future directions in the discipline, areas which were less developed in 2015, which are now much more prominent within the discipline and within disciplinary debates. One could obviously reference the transnational modern languages work there, amongst many other things. So hopefully you find some of that in this document and that is useful in that respect. Obviously, it's something that we would appreciate your feedback on. Ed is going to talk a little bit more about some of the areas that the QAA template and QAA structures are bringing into all subject benchmark statements now around areas that are massively important to the values and the ethos of languages, cultures, and societies as a collection of disciplines. So things like EDI, inclusivity, accessibility, sustainability, working in that global context, and obviously entrepreneurship and innovation. And Rasha will follow up on that with some reflections on a couple of other areas. But I guess bearing in mind that we've got probably another 3 weeks of the consultation period left, there were 2 areas when we were engaged in our long discussions on Teams calls over the last 6 months that we kind of kept coming around, and we've tried to resolve somehow in the document, but really appreciate thoughts on them. And as Emma's already indicated, one of them is around what is the level, what is the benchmark level for a graduate in languages, cultures, and societies. And obviously, the whole point of that terminology, languages, cultures, and societies, is that we are thinking about a subject area that integrates the study or the acquisition or the enhancement of existing language skills with building knowledge of global cultures and societies, and building the skills which enable us to mediate between both languages, cultures, and societies. But when we came to trying to define what the benchmark attainment level for a languages, cultures, and societies graduate would be, we do have to come up against, well, how are we going to frame this? And in 2015, the benchmark statement used the Common European Framework of Reference for languages. And we've retained that. And we've retained the C1 level there. And we'd really appreciate thoughts on how much currency that has within the disciplinary community. Is that something that you talk about within education committees in your schools? Does it mean something to graduates? It's clearly got, it's got a global profile. It's a framework reference that's been in development for many years. So we're interested in that question as one, because we really did deliberate about this as to whether C1 was actually the right level nowadays, given I won't say too much more about that because Rasha will follow up on this, but just to plant that one. The other one was terminology around year abroad, residence abroad, period of residence abroad. Because this document really does think about European, Asian, Middle Eastern, Arabic languages, the whole global family of languages, alongside community languages within the UK, and also the national languages, Irish, Scots Gaelic, and Welsh. It became very clear that abroad was not the right term. For those reasons, we already know that the year abroad isn't necessarily a year. It could be 6 months, 5 months. It's a period, but year abroad is still, we have integrated the term at least once into the document, but we've moved away from reference to year abroad and to abroad for the reason I've just outlined, and also because quite a lot of that immersive learning in terms of language and culture over recent years has been virtual and may well be virtual and more virtual in the future. So it's trying to think about how you frame that. And we've gone to terminology like immersive pedagogies, periods of immersion within the language and the culture. So again, does that feel right to you? Again, it's trying to think about inclusive terminology and inclusive framings of our discipline. So those were the two things, in addition to getting your general views on the subject benchmark statement, whether we've missed things, whether we've gotten things wrong, whether we've got the emphasis wrong, or, the feedback could also be positive. You think we've done, it presents a good picture of our discipline, and obviously that's what we hope, but we are we're really keen to hear if there are things that you don't think are quite right in here, that if you were taking this document into your department or your school, that wouldn't quite, that it might just not land perfectly. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ed to talk about some of those initial changes within the document, that introductory section.
Thank you, Nigel. Thanks very much. And I think just to kind of begin by underlining, as Nigel said, the wide representation that we had on the advisory group. There were more than 20 of us, including a student representative from a wide range of departments and institutions across the United Kingdom. And we felt that was a really kind of powerful demonstration of that breadth of expertise and a variety of subjects that fall within languages, cultures, and societies. And I think that really fed through in terms of what we hope we've kind of managed to capture that breadth and range in the statement that we've set out. And as Nigel says, one of the big changes from the last versions of the statement were in the template given to us by the QAA, and specifically a preliminary section, the section 1, which asked us to think about our subject areas in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, accessibility, which is related but also slightly different from inclusion, questions of sustainability, which of course in the context of subjects where many of our students will spend time in abroad or around the world, raises some quite interesting questions, I think, for us in a kind of a context of kind of climate development. And then also sections on employability and entrepreneurship. So just in terms of each of those, and you'll see if you've had a chance to look at the benchmark statement that we have specific sections which address each of those areas in turn. And what we then aim to do is take through some of those themes and run them through all the remaining aspects of the document. So we were asked, as we were in previous documents, to talk in terms of the distinctive features of a degree in languages, cultures and societies, and then more specifically in terms of the content, methods of learning and teaching, methods of assessment. And we were as we wrote those following sections, 2 and 3 in particular, we were mindful of capturing some of the things that we'd raised in the context of equality, diversity and inclusion and accessibility and sustainability, weaving those through the document. And I think one of the things that struck me, and I don't know if this was shared amongst the group, but certainly kind of struck me, was the extent to which thinking about the kinds of topics that we explore, generally speaking, across LCS degrees, the kinds of things that we get our students to do, the kinds of questions that we confront them with, the kinds of methodologies that we develop with them, actually means that these questions of equality, diversity, inclusion in particular are absolutely embedded within the work that we do with our students. And that's not just in terms of the topics that we might cover with them, but also in terms, for example, of the development of critical skills of thinking, of analysis, of developing an argument, of listening to other arguments, of judging and being aware of one's own positioning in a debate as well. So from that point of view, we felt that we were able to demonstrate quite articulately, quite clearly, the ways in which equality and diversity, inclusion, and questions of accessibility and openness, the openness of languages, cultures, and societies degrees, is really kind of underpinning a lot of the pedagogical work we do, a lot of the analytical, critical, and theoretical and reflective work that we do, and we get our students to do as well. So these weren't sort of, you could envisage these as exercises in having to kind of formulae that would satisfy the QAA or end up being quite generic statements around questions of equality or diversity or inclusion. But no, in actual fact, we found that our degrees were able to set out very clearly. We were able to set out very clearly how it is that our degrees help our students to develop those attributes, that understanding. So that I think was kind of very powerful in helping us to position language, culture, and societies degrees in terms of how they enable students to develop all aspects of a kind of a critical understanding of the world and an approach to learning that's quite valuable. The sustainability question was a very interesting one. Again, in two ways. In the first place, because of, again, how, given the diversity of subjects that we put before our students and work with them on, those questions of sustainability that we measured against some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we picked out a few of those SDGs as the acronym has it, in thinking about the kinds of ways in which our courses invite students to think through the implications of sustainable development. So, for example, achieving gender equality, reducing inequality, promoting, and number 16 in particular of the development goals was particularly resonant here, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So, if you think across the diverse areas that we cover in Latin America, in different parts of the world, within Europe as well, seeing how our courses could embed those goals in the kinds of subjects, the topics that we cover with the students, was again quite valuable to us. But as I indicated, there is an interesting question that merits reflection and really picks up on the point that Nigel made about how we kind of tussled with the question of time spent abroad, and in a context where, of all subjects, I think we have to be mindful about how our students have that immersive experience in an increasingly kind of problematic context of global warming and climate change. I think that question of sustainability looking forward over the next period is one that I think might be quite challenging actually sometimes for us to address in terms of how we think about these questions of sustainability and resource and so on and so forth. So the sustainability one I felt was very kind of was interesting, both in terms of, again, how it really allowed us to articulate what it is that LCS degrees do, but also by posing some quite interesting questions to us as a subject group. And then lastly, and then I'll hand on to Rasha in a couple of minutes. Obviously, it goes without saying, cela va sans dire, as the French would say, that the QA was keen for us to address how our degrees prepare our students and frame them and develop them with reference to skills of employability, skills of entrepreneurship and enterprise, and therefore in terms of preparing preparing for future careers and for employability. And again, I think we could be quite clear about how our degrees do that through the range of skills that they enable our students to acquire, and in particular those skills that sometimes our students can't necessarily articulate and we can't necessarily articulate because they just emerge through the degree. So skills of critical thinking, skills of flexibility, resilience, all those things actually, for example, that they manage to acquire through the year abroad in particular, as well as all the different ways in which we teach them in terms of group work and collaboration and co-production and so forth. So again, I felt that by the end of the process, we had a very kind of clear, but also very confident statement of what it is that our degrees can do for our students, and that we can do with our students as they work their way through the degree. And I think from that point of view, having those embedded concepts to think with, that we were tasked to do by the QAA was actually really helpful in giving us a focus and giving us a framework that allowed us to really draw out some very kind of significant things that our degrees do. At this point, I'll hand on to Rasha, who's going to talk a little bit more about C1 and language acquisition levels and this question of proficiency that we also spent quite a lot of time thinking about.
Thank you so much, Ed and Nigel. I think I have much less to say now because you clarified quite a few points. But I thought maybe I can share my experience as well, as it was the first time for me to get involved in the advisory group. And the interesting thing for me was that I used to be a receiver of the SBS before, and contributing to the discussion this time was really insightful. So I do remember a conversation that was like more than 10 years ago now, about the benchmarking with the C1 versus C2, as I understand it used to be C2 at some point, and how difficult that was for us as academics to ensure that our students who are learning diverse languages graduate with that very high level of proficiency, C2, which then changed in one of the previous SBS reviews to C1, and which remained as a C1 in the current statement. But I do remember that for a language like Arabic, for example, and other non-European languages, having the framework and having the C1 as a benchmark, it was a clear goal to aim to. A language like Arabic, for example, we don't have our own proficiency scale to use, so we do have to rely on the CEFR, and it did have an impact on our degrees, not only the degrees, but the languages for all, languages learned as optional modules, for example. More and more academics are aware now of what a C1 means. So this definitely has a big role to play in teaching non-European languages, particularly. I wanted also to say that during the experience of being involved with in the advisory board, I felt that a lot of the things that happened in the last 3 years with COVID, with lots of political changes, with the climate change, with all of this, we had in our minds as board members, diversity we're thinking about. And as Ed mentioned, whether it was, we were talking about sustainability, talking about employability, the issues about residence abroad versus having a virtual study abroad or even an immersive study in country, we were thinking about all the issues that our students have been facing in the last couple of years specifically. the other thing that I wanted to mention as well is while we were having our discussions, we were always thinking about the different disciplines that we have here, that we couldn't separate from each other. Languages, cultures, societies, intercultural understanding. We had to think about all of these together at the same time. And again, with the issue of flexibility and diversity in our mind. There were times when it was a bit tricky to separate our discussion from what we thought our colleagues looking at linguistics, for example, where we're talking about. We felt that LCS graduates need to have understanding of the social linguistics and the meta-linguistics of the languages that they were learning. Even if they're not doing a degree in linguistics, they needed that kind of information, which will help them later in their employability as well. So we had to link with other subject areas as well, particularly linguistics, I would say. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, which also relate to the diversity that Ed and Nigel mentioned, is that we try to really ensure that the terminology used in the benchmark statement does reflect that openness and inclusivity. So I actually had a quick look at the documents that we have now and the one from 2019. And if you compare the word native, for example, you will find it not mentioned in the current statement, except once. And I'm going to try quickly to find that sentence to read to you. Yeah, so it's section 1.16, where it says inclusive approaches to language teaching in LCS courses avoid exclusionary assumptions of language competence, such as native speakerism, which links language ability to ethnicity or nationality rather than measured proficiency. So that is something added to the new document that our audience today may wish to look at. Other terminology that we try to also avoid was the modern languages, which does relate to the whole aim of this event. And in terms of diversity or linguistic diversity, you will find a particular mention of accents and dialects. And I think that was in section 1.17, in which we were highlighting the importance of really diversifying what we teach and ensure that graduates have a good understanding of how languages work in real life, and not to feel limited to a certain type of any of the languages that they are studying. If I go back to the issue of the CFR benchmark statement, the C1, we did indeed have a lot of discussions about this, and we still felt that C1 is what is needed by employers. However, this is not always easy for all languages and not for all students, in fact. There is a lot more diversity happening in terms of what the students bring to us when they start their undergraduate study. They don't all come at ab initio level, and sometimes it's a false ab initio level. We have a lot of what we call heritage learners who come with some understanding of the language, and then they progress at different paces, and then they graduate with different levels. But what is important here is that we still have some benchmark to look at. So we felt by the end of the discussion is that C1 is still what is needed, especially by employers, but we also specified B2 as an alternative for certain languages and for certain students. So particularly those who came to study a non-European language at ab initio level, they may not be able to attain the C1, but B2 is what we specified. And this is something was not, I think, stated in the 2019 statement. It was left a little bit open for these non-European languages. But now we feel that at least we've got something stated there that helps course designers, teachers, students, employers as well, to know exactly what to expect. I think that's everything I wanted to highlight, really. And yeah, probably I'll hand over to Emma again.
Lovely. Thanks so much to all three of you for setting that all out so clearly. And I'm hoping that there are lots of questions and comments from people in the room once they've had a chance to reflect on that. And feel free, I think, as Kathy said earlier, if you want to put any questions in the chat, and I will attempt to sort of shuttle between, well, live, it's not really live, virtual room and chat room. I don't know, perhaps if anybody wanted to think first of all about the two specific areas that Nigel highlighted that I think all of you talked about in various ways. So the as Rasha's just said, this benchmark attainment level and that questions around that. And then I think, Nigel, the other thing was to do with terminology, wasn't it? And particularly perhaps the residence not abroad, the virtual, what was it called in the end? Virtual residency or virtual
placement,
virtual placements,
yeah. Immersive pedagogy. We went with quite a lot of different things to try and encapsulate what probably is much more varied practice out there now than perhaps would have been the case certainly 20 years ago when the very first subject benchmark statement for our discipline was published, and our disciplines. And I should have said the other question we put out, and it picks up on Rasha's point, is that, and actually Ed's point as well about the diversity of our languages, cultures, and societies, is just that general question in the consultation: does this document adequately represent all sort of sub-disciplines or sub-areas within that broad LCS disciplinary area? With all of the kind of the principles, the values, the ethos that Charles and Noah have spoken to. I hope we've captured some of that, and that no matter what area of the discipline you come from, that you find it does speak to your part of the discipline. And if it doesn't, do tell us what's missing or what we haven't quite got right, because I think we're really, really keen for this to be a document that does speak for all of us.
I think I see a hand. Is that Joe Lee? Did you want to come in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Yeah, okay, hi. I wasn't sure were you taking questions in the chat or in person, but I'll go through it.
Both.
Okay, great. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you really for producing a document that I think really takes us into the future. I think this is future-proofing us. I think it does a really good job in expressing the values of a language's degree in terms, not just in terms of the linguistic communication, but cultural literacy as well. I'm working on sustainability for our university at the moment, so really appreciate that sustainability is giving examples which aren't just about climate change and carbon footprint, is extending it into social equality, social justice, gender equality, and so on. I think my main questions were in terms of what's important for Italian in as an ab initio, normally an ab initio language, and thinking about the year abroad. And I think it's important we've got that flexibility of the year abroad, because with the loss of Erasmus now, that really is changing. But I wonder how we can really develop those cultural competency skills in a virtual exchange, which is naturally time limited. I'm a little bit nervous about that. And the other thing is about the C1 level, and I think it's been reinforced that we are looking for a C1 level. But when I'm reading the statement, I'm finding it quite confusing, because it's saying, depending on their starting point and depending on whether they've been abroad or not. And I just wanted some clarification as to what that level is for an ab initio student who hasn't been able to go abroad. Are we actually saying that students can come up with different levels there? Is it a B2? Is it a C1? I was a little bit confused as to what that was. So I think those are the main questions. I think a lot of it is really, really good and takes us into the future. Those are the areas that I'm more concerned about, is how do we develop those cultural skills in a virtual exchange, and is it a C1 we're looking for? If not, how do we differentiate students who come out with the same degree title but with different levels of language competency? Does that make sense?
I don't know who's going to attack that first.
Sorry,
Rasha,
Rasha has her hand up, so
yeah, I thought I'll speak first. Say whatever I have in mind. Thank you so much, Joe, for the question. I think we did think about this, and that's why you will see the C1 and you will see the B2. I think something less, a level less than B2 for a joint honors graduate will not be enough. So we saw that B2 would be the minimum, and we thought there could be lots of different reasons and lots of different factors impacting reaching the C1 level. But if a student couldn't reach that, then they can still graduate with a B2 joint honors, as far as I understand, and I'm sure Nigel and Ed can add to this or correct me as well. When thinking about the residence abroad or the immersive program, we were also thinking about opportunities in the country when students can work with the community speaking the language here, in order to engage with them and also to engage with the culture, not just the language. And that could be some sort of an alternative to the traditional residence abroad well, outside the country, of course. Sorry, that's what I wanted to say, but I'll leave it for Nigel and Ed now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rasha. Thank you, Joe. Those are really good questions. I think the C1 B2 question, I think, is one that we really did grapple with. And in the end, the QAA statement asks us really to define what the sort of threshold skill level is. And that's why we deliberate a lot about C1. If you graduate with it, threshold is meant probably to speak to sort of third class honors, perhaps the sort of lower parts of a 2-2 classification. What is the language level there? The answer is, I think we came up with, it was so diverse, probably because of all the other skills and knowledges and understandings that any languages, cultures and societies degree is testing. But we felt there probably was something about making that statement, as Rasha said, about C1 being what we're really aiming for in terms of the value added. So if we've been somewhat unclear in sort of saying, we would expect C1, and then there are certain disciplines, Rasha has spoken to that, or languages, subdisciplines where we may not feel that is achievable. If we haven't been as clear on that, and if there's some ambiguity there, then we've absolutely got to kind of take that back and have a look at it. And if there's anything in terms of the phrasing, Joe, that you want to suggest or that you think is particularly problematic, do let us know. I think the virtual one is a really interesting one. Can you get all of those cultural skills? I suspect to some extent the jury is out on that. I suspect it would be difficult because you just don't have that day-to-day contact with the culture and the society, the kind of was the sort of almost the ethnographic kind of immersion and experience. And I picked up some research that is definitely sort of pointing towards, if not the cultural skills that students can get from a virtual placement or exchange, but certainly some of those cultural insights that they can get. And certainly that, I think you spoke about the sort of values, the ethos, some of that they certainly can pick that up, and maybe that's where we need to go on this, that it can never substitute completely for kind of being in Rome for 6 months, or Berlin or Buenos Aires or wherever, but that you get some of that understanding, that you exercise those cultural mediation skills on a daily basis, even in that virtual placement. So again, it was one of the things that we spent a lot of time trying to think through. We probably don't have the answers yet, but I don't think the benchmark statement is there to give answers. It's to kind of say where we are, and where we are at the moment is probably in that period of slight flux and uncertainty. So we probably just need to keep reflecting that and discussing it and thinking more about it.
Great, thanks so much for that, Ed. Was there anything you wanted to add there, or?
Only just to kind of take us back to the statement of 4.10, where we one of the ways in which we try to articulate around the C1 question was the phrase threshold graduates are working towards or operating at level C1, and I think that was our attempt to recognise that between the B2 and the C1 there's going to be a kind of a grey zone where some of our students might land, and I think we felt that having that little hedge or caveat, the working towards or operating at, was a fair way of trying to signal that you're not, C1 is going to be the majority, but there might be cases where you've got people who are sort of, if you like, more than B2, less than C1, or whatever it might be. I'd agree with Nigel that we can certainly, off the back of Joe's observations and questions, we can go back. We have another meeting in November where we'll be reflecting on the feedback that we've received through the consultation, and we can go back, maybe, Nigel, and have a look at that wording again and just make sure that we're comfortable that it's doing what it needs to do. But it was quite a challenging bit to write, actually, even though it's only like 3 or 4 words,
Thanks very much for that. I'm just looking for hands, but I can see we've already got a question in the chat from Katie. Hopefully you can all see it, but essentially she asked about one particular sentence which states that students should express themselves fluently and spontaneously, sorry, I can't even read, and says that, and I'm sure she's not alone, that they've had increasing difficulty in Exeter, is it, in convincing university management to kind of get behind live exams, to prove that students can, still Exeter, that students can express themselves spontaneously. So I think you're asking, Katie, sorry, I'm speaking for you, but whether other people feel that spontaneity is an important and necessary attribute to maintain and test, and how to push back against this move, or a possible move to all coursework or non-invigilated exams. I don't know if anyone, perhaps initially on the subject benchmark statement panel, has got any views on that. It's a difficult line, isn't it, to sort of tread between actually saying these things and sort of treading around them.
As Nigel said, we were, the guidance from QAA was to be descriptive, not prescriptive. That said, I think there were clearly points where we felt that prescriptive description was probably the way to go on certain areas, and assessing language proficiency through, for example, an oral exam would be, I think we felt that would have to be an integral part of the assessment of language proficiency, you know. So from that point of view, I mean, I think if you look at the statement, when it comes to assessment, you know, we're very clear. You know, we're very clear, and it comes up several times that oral discussions, oral presentations are, you know, front and center of that assessment of language proficiency. So, I mean, I think if you're in a situation where people are questioning how you assess that, I think this is a point where you can maybe draw their attention to the benchmark statements, and I hope that there are sufficient kind of statements in there that are powerful enough for them to be persuasive with whoever you need to persuade, you know. But certainly, I mean, it's no brainer that you can have an oral exam to test language proficiency, you know, no brainer.
Thanks for that. Is that okay, Katie? And I'm not sure, we've got quite a few hands up. I'm not sure if you're coming in on this particular question. It was Ruth, I think, and then Olga, or whether these were different questions.
Mine was on this question.
Excellent. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. No, because I you know, instinctively, I respond the way Ed has outlined there. And when I read this question first, I was thinking precisely along those lines. How do we push back? Well, we refer to the benchmark statement. That's how we push back against university pushes, you know, when it's trying to push us in certain directions. However, in this particular case, there is a disability issue that can impede on this. So I think, as with the last statement where you talked about the difference between C1 and you know, and B2, that question of working towards, because there will be individual students who will have DSS statements that mean that they cannot be tested in this way, and so the obviously the benchmark needs to take account of that.
Thanks very much for that response, Ruth. And Olga, I don't know, again, were you coming in on that or something else entirely?
No, indeed I was on this too, because it's something that we touched on a little bit, but we were all very much in the middle of it, you know, in terms of assessment and online assessment, and how we were assessing translation, how we were assessing oral. And I think this is not so much a question for the benchmark, but more actually for Emma, for you and UCML, that what I'm noticing is that different subject associations are making sort of statements around the need for in-person exams, for, you know, for, let's say, for maths has been a big one recently. And I think that this would be an important thing for the language community to start having an opinion on, and I think in those pushbacks against online assessment, having the Institute of Linguists and UCML, you know, having a statement on it is really, really helpful. We don't have PSRBs, but, you know, if that becomes a kind of almost PSRB type of discussion around, you know, in order to assess these skills, it must be in person. That can be really, really helpful to universities. So I think it's only something that bubbled up a little bit, but we were very much in the middle of that debate. And you know, it came up a bit when we were looking at teaching and learning and assessment of translation, and a few of us shared quite different ways in which assessment was having to be done this year because of being online. But the question is, if universities are staying online, that would change our curriculum and our pedagogy. And do we want that? We may want it, but I think it's an important one that Katie's brought up. Thanks,
Olga. Yes, I have a feeling that's on my desk at the moment at UCML. So that's definitely something to think about. I don't know whether any of our panelists wanted to respond on that. It's a difficult line to tread, as we said, isn't it? And I mean, I was thinking also on the virtual or immersive placement question. You know, whether it's the case that actually that's sending a signal to, you know, playing devil's advocate, is that sending a signal to universities to say actually students can get there, can acquire all these skills without having to go to, you know, wherever it happens to be. So actually let's just axe, you know, compulsory residence abroad
it is an interesting one, and I perhaps speak as someone who's part of evil university management. So I'll wear two hats here: my PVC hat and my professor of French hat. I think we certainly don't want to have anything in this statement that would move us away from, I suppose, that immersive in-person, in-country experience that we have all benefited, probably all of us on this call, or many of us on this call, have benefited from and continue to benefit from. So I think that's still absolutely there. But I guess what we've tried to do is to think around how you do that in an inclusive way, and that is thinking about the students who can't do that for all sorts of reasons. Ruth mentioned disabilities. There will be other students for health, mental health reasons, for financial reasons, may well not be able to do this. So how do you ensure that our degree programs can deliver some of that learning, maybe slightly different learning, different sets of skills that they can pick up? So it's definitely not to move away or to give an opportunity to abolish the 4-year degree as somehow the standard. And I think we've tried to reflect that here. And I guess it's the same for thinking about how we assess. And we have put things about inclusive assessment in the document. I just looked at section 1.13, online blended can increase access for students who've got, who may be commuting, studying part-time, have disabilities, health conditions, learning differences, particular needs. I'm wondering, on the back of, I guess, Katie's question and Ruth's reflection, whether we just need to check in on this, that we've got enough on inclusive assessment in here, that we've reflected that there are, that, Ed's right, there's a whole list of assessment techniques which include the structured oral conversation, interpreting, kind of video, production of video material, all sorts of things which certainly speak to, spontaneous interaction, mediation, as a key part of the skill base that a graduate of our discipline should have. But just balancing that with the need to make those adjustments, which I think we all do where needed. So that's probably one that I would take away as another one, just for us to check that we've got the language right there. On Olga's question about accreditation, I think that's the sort of accredited degree, and what that then kind of, I suppose, obliges universities to do, because if if you're not, your architecture degree isn't recognized by the relevant accrediting bodies, or your accounting and finance degree, students won't take it. And that does impose a lot of restrictions on the types of assessment. Though I have to say, my experience of those PSRBs more recently is that they too are trying to move away from some of that rigidity that has perhaps characterized them, the sort of prescriptive, you must have, in-person exams for accounting, you must have certain things, that there's a reflection of the need there, and it's values-based as well, that kind of real desire to make sure that in imposing those prescriptions, you're not excluding huge numbers of people from a particular profession effectively, and challenging themselves on that. So I think balancing that kind of desire for perhaps some prescription with, I think, those values, that ethos of openness and inclusion, that as Ed so powerfully put it, really characterize our students and our disciplines.
Thanks so much for that response, Nigel. I can see a hand raised here by Andrew.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Sorry, I was going to ask something different, if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay. I hope my internet stays good. Every kid in our street seems to be on the PlayStation tonight. I am a bit of an interloper into this, in that I took over as subject group leader for our languages and cultures subject group only 6 months ago as a temporary assignment to take the group through a revalidation. So my world is entrepreneurship and management, and my 6 months have been fabulous, fabulously fascinating. I've only just, because I don't know the structures, been able to read the old benchmark statement and the new one. I have to say they're a lot better than the business and management ones. I work for a new university, and we're at the fault line of the languages world, I like to call it, in that we are only just able to run our languages and cultures degrees because of student recruitment. As a result of which, we can only run major and minor languages degrees, 2/3 as a major, 1/3 as a minor. And I don't quite understand, sorry to be naive, I don't quite understand where the majors and minors fit into the benchmark statements, the requirements that we have, the different requirements for majors and minors, and how the language element of those might differ, and what it might look like under the new structures. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Does anyone want to respond to that one from the panel? Maybe Nigel, are you?
I'm willing to give it a go, Andrew. I think we've tried to be, I mean, we are covering everything from effectively a single honours degree through to, I think broadly what we are thinking of is that the language study would probably represent about a half of your study time for this, to think about the skills base, the range of competencies, etc., that you would have with reference to this subject benchmark statement. And I presume when you're talking about major, minor,
yes,
the language, culture, society part is the minor effective.
Well, we have it both. We have we offer the major and the minor. And increasingly, you see, the route that is coming through more popularly is the minor route.
Yeah.
That's where our future is going to lie.
Yeah.
In the minor route, and I've been brought in to future-proof the subject group for the next 10 years, and I am determined to do that. And I have to say, this benchmark really helps.
Good. And I think it's therefore, you know, the benchmark is not to say this is what you must do. It's not to say this is what your students must achieve, because it's that range of achievement will be broad. The range of study that they could undertake is particularly broad. But to give you some tools and some ideas of where you might start to kind of think about referencing your provision, I think it's that rather than this, you know, really trying to set out what your subject group should be doing. I think that was your question, wasn't it? It was around how this applied to your field, really.
Yes, because I mean that's where we're coming more and more. And the other way in which I'm future-proofing my subject group is by us providing modules for other departments, particularly in terms of the cultures as part. And I've been amazed by. I'm sorry to sound so naive, but the breadth of the study in languages and cultures, it's absolutely fabulous. There's something in there for absolutely everybody. And now I want to include that in wider validations across the Department of Management and the business school where we sit. And they want that. In some ways, I would also quite like to be so slightly guided about how these elements can be incorporated into wider curriculums. And you're going to tell me that's not what you were asked to do.
I am, in a way, yes, obviously, but I think we've got a fantastic champion in you in terms of someone not from who works clearly in a business school context, proselytizing for languages, cultures, and societies, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I think if there's something more specific that, you know, any of us on the subject group can perhaps help with, Andrew, I mean, don't hesitate to get in touch offline if there's something kind of more specific that we can perhaps advise on. But you're right, the subject benchmark statement is there to be a fairly broad kind of, is what it says on the tin, a statement of where we are kind of as a discipline, rather than perhaps, and for people then to be able to draw on that, interpret it, translate it, if you like, into what's relevant in their, you know, in terms of the degree programs that you're running, and also the institutional context, because again, that varies enormously. So it's again, it's operating in that gray zone where you can kind of take some of this and apply it, and some of it may just be less relevant to your context in the same way that it will be in most institutions.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been really interesting. I've learned a lot listening to the whole discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Andrew. And as you know, you've got that offer there to contact people offline. So that's great from Nigel. Thank you for that. Just to mention, Connor's put a comment in the chat, which I think people have probably seen about the year abroad there. So unless you wanted to come in, Connor, I don't know if you did at this point about the year abroad. If not, I was wondering, since obviously we had Charles and Inoa right at the beginning, whether there's anything either that you two wanted to comment on to sort of bring these two things together, or whether there was anything that anybody else wanted to oh, thanks, Connor. Anything anyone else wanted to mention about that specifically, or perhaps about this wider question of identity? It's obviously something I'm thinking about. I asked people on Twitter, as one does, about the UCML and whether we should drop the modern. So if there's anything perhaps that you want to go back to on that, since we've only got 6 minutes.
Yeah, just very quickly, and this possibly isn't something that we can answer now, but part of it is the longer life of the document. This has implications for how we articulate with what's taught at schools, which is rather fraught at the moment, considering recent innovations in GCSE teaching. It has implications as to the way the REF is going to be set up in the future. And above all, it really does, it needs to be thought about and thought through in the BA's language gateway. Otherwise, there is a possibility of disconnection between very important initiatives. So that longer triangulation of these initiatives is something that we do need to think about as a community. And what we might do is a little bit later think about how one can meaningfully draw these initiatives together. But possibly a very quick reflection on the longer life of the document would be interesting.
Thanks for that, Charles. Nigel, Ed, Rasha?
It's a really good question, Charles, and I think having just sent the document out into the world, I guess it's a good time to really start to think about that. I really like your the point that you made about how we need to join this up with the BA's gateway to languages kind of work and thinking about that school curriculum. And I guess if this document can do something that is positioning the subject community beyond just that QAA framework, which is within that broad quality assurance kind of our languages, cultures, societies, degrees doing what students, employers, universities kind of think they should be. We can go beyond that. I think that would be fantastic. So I think there's perhaps an opportunity right now with UCML or whatever UCML might become, the Institute and the British Academy to actually think about this. And if we've got some of the future, Andrew talked a lot about future proofing. I think we've tried in the subject benchmark statement advisory group to sort of at least be pointing out some future directions for the set of disciplines. if we can start to pull on those, that would be a really interesting further development of this. I'll confess I haven't given that any more thought than that. So I probably my short answer to you is challenge accepted. Ed, Rasha?
Just to add to what Charles and Nigel said about the future, that made me just reflect on the benchmark statement, and perhaps we need to make our undergraduates aware of it, because they are the future. They will be the school language educators at some point. They will be the future researchers and academics at some point, and it would be great that they are aware of this work. We're doing all of this for them, but they might not be aware of all of this, and it would be great if they take this forward in the future as language teachers, as researchers, and so on.
Ed, do you want to come in as well?
I think just to reinforce that point in terms of the guidance, the instruction for QAA is very much to make this a readable document, a document that can be read by non-specialists and people outside, and with their help, I think we've managed to achieve that. And the other thing that I'd hope that we've managed to do, and why it's worth, I think, really kind of pushing it, I think it makes LCS courses look really exciting. I mean, in terms of drawing in prospective students, okay, you wouldn't necessarily hand it out an open day, but just in terms of reading it and giving a sense of the breadth and the depth of the disciplines, I would hope that people can maybe mobilize it and draw on it as they're promoting the subject to people who might want to see themselves as LCS students and graduates. And it's certainly the case that, I mean, undoubtedly, as previous versions of the document have, there will be iterations of it, they'll be updated, but I'd certainly agree. I'd also accept the challenge of working kind of collectively on how we can use it as one of the legs or one of the prongs of our push or attack on ensuring that an understanding of LCS and what it is that we do is out there and well disseminated. And I hope people do find this a kind of a compelling statement of what it is that we're trying to do in our everyday in the university kind of context.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that. I think that's probably quite a good note to come to a close on. Just to acknowledge in the chat, people have been mentioning other subject associations, of course, yes, very much involved. ALL and AMLUC, of course, as part of UCML, also very much involved. So thank you so much to everybody, to Charles and Ainoa and Nigel, Ed, Rasha, for all that food for thought. And please do go online and respond to the consultation. I don't know, perhaps you want to put a link, or perhaps Kathy might put a link in the chat to that, but that should be fairly easy to find, I think, Nigel, shouldn't it, online?
Kathy is ahead of us as ever. It's
wonderful.
right at the top of the chat, and she's probably just pasted it again, and she has indeed. So do go on to it. It's only about 6 questions. It'd be great if individuals want to respond, but if you want to take it to departmental meetings, school education committees, whatever, to give a collective response from a group of interested colleagues and indeed students, we'd be delighted, because I think it will help us do that piece of work that I think Charles has kind of really challenged us all to do, to think about how a document like this becomes part of that future story of our discipline, and how we use it in that way with various stakeholders. And if it can do that alongside meeting the QAA requirements, I think that would be fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And thanks everyone for attending, and see you in a virtual room soon.
And thank you so much, Emma, for chairing that, and everyone for coming. And I think we have our next meeting already planned. Wonderful session. Thank you so much. And thank you, of course, to Kathy for making everything possible. So see everyone again soon. And thank you again.